The glory of the Great Khans will be restored, and once the NCR is pushed back to California, all the land from here to the Colorado will be ours. Steadfast words, spoken by an unyielding man. Papa Khan, or the Khan of Khans as he coins himself, speaks like a mighty emperor, yet his people waste away in Red Rock Canyon, manufacturing chems in dilapidated trailers, profiting from the rattling throes of violent addicts. The Great Khans are at Red Rock Bottom, yet their grizzled leader preaches of reclaiming the tribe's lost glory. However, the only redemption for these raiders may be to accept that the glory of the past is an empty dream, and a reformation is long overdue. The question is, can they overcome their crippling vices, which are so heavily fueled by conceit, to become something better, something worthy of pride? Or will their poor judgment lead them to extinction? Hey guys, it's Drew here and welcome back to FudgeMuppet. The past couple of weeks have been a little bizarre to us here at FudgeMuppet. As a longtime fan of this amazing series, I never would have imagined that a major open world Fallout game would come out, only for me to hate it. If you'd told me at the start of the year, hey Drew, Fallout West Virginia is coming out this year, I would have ran down the street naked in nothing but my Pip-Boy and a Brotherhood of Steel helmet. I'm not going to hate on the game here though, and if you're enjoying it, that's honestly great. Without giving too much away, Scott has an enormous video in the works that will detail all of our thoughts on Fallout 76, and as lovers of world building and lore, we thought it would be fitting to also talk about what the game could have been. Scott's pretty much rebuilt the game from the ground up. That's how much world building he's done. But anyway, I thought it would be a great time to show some appreciation for Fallout's rich, detailed and well thought out lore. You know, before the integrity of the series' lore gave way to brand recognition and cash grabs. And what better way to reminisce about the series we all love so much than by returning to New Vegas, to one of our absolute favourite factions, a faction with a long history reaching all the way back to Fallout and Fallout 2. In this video, we're going to explore the lore of the Great Khans, and we'll discuss their fate, which hangs well and truly in the balance. Extinction and prosperity are separated by a few decisions, but I believe this gang can recover from decades of hardship, and they can be redeemed. The Khans were one of the 4 groups to emerge from Vault 15 in the year 2141, along with the raider gangs named the Jackals, the Vipers, and the settlers who would establish the community known as Shady Sands. In the early days of the gang, little distinguished them from your run-of-the-mill savages. They were a tribal society, they were semi-organised, and they were governed by basic social Darwinian principles, i.e. survival of the fittest. I'm sure there were those among their ranks who would have liked some more nuanced systems of governance, but those individuals would likely have been killed off by the larger, stronger gang members. Such is the charm of natural selection. Those who did subscribe to the gang's brutal way of life were rewarded for their ferocity. The gang was of course named after the legendary Mongol Empire, and their astounding conquests spanning the 13th century. The Mongols were ruled by the Khans, and in adopting their name, the Khans of New California hoped to replicate their military efficacy. The Khans were renowned for their relentless onslaughts on local towns. They would raid everything of value, burn what they could not carry, and even utilise the surviving settlers for slave labour. It wasn't just their brutality, of course, that was modelled after the Mongols. The Khans were so effective in their pillaging because they travelled in small scouting bands, similar to the Mongol Arbans, which were squads of 10 men, and like the Mongols, used this reconnaissance to gain the edge in fights. The eagerness of the Khans to display their strength was a huge contributor to their success. When engaged in combat with a foe, Khans would strive to prove their worthiness through feats of strength. This often meant tackling armed enemies in hand-to-hand combat, sometimes bare-fisted, or perhaps with brass knuckles and clubs. They lived to fight, and fought with unmatched fervour. Aside from the clear Mongolian imagery inspiring their clothing styles, settlements and emblem, the Khans were notable for founding the post-war chem trade. They are known to make jet, psycho and many other addictive chems, and this trade bolstered their affluence alongside their looting and pillaging. The Khans certainly have their quirks, but that's hardly enough to suggest they're anything more than an opportunistic blight to the post-apocalyptic West Coast. They could easily have faded into obscurity like the Vipers and the Jackals, who soon became as irrelevant as they were primitive and barbaric, crushed by the weight of the NCR's democratic justice. What makes the Khans truly unique was their ability to survive their almost inevitable extinction not once, not twice, but 3 times. It's a handy trait to have in a world ravaged by total atomic annihilation. Like the roaches at Ground Zero, the Khans could face their ruination and rise again, battered but not bested. Their first brush with extinction came 20 years after their creation. The Khans gang was founded by an unnamed man, known only as the father of Gal Defhand. Under his leadership, the Khans raided local towns and villages and were relatively prosperous. Sometime before the year 2161, Gal Defhand killed his father, taking control of the Khans in a quite fitting Khan fashion, by employing a brutal lack of compassion and by displaying his superior strength. By killing his own father, he'd proven to the gang that he was in fact the fittest, and therefore the most eligible to lead them. Under Gal's leadership, the Khans set up a permanent base of operations conveniently southeast of their main target, Shady Sands. Under Gal's leadership, little else changed. He continued to do what his father had done before him, orchestrating raids of the local settlements. His father would have been proud of his work, at least he might have been if his own son hadn't gone and killed him. They were, for the most part, efficient in their work, and had many productive slaves. However, their crucial mistake was kidnapping a young woman named Tandy, a girl with much promise, and the right friends. When the Vault Dweller came to liberate her from her captors, the Khans were utterly routed. Almost every member was slain by the Vault Dweller, the mighty Gal Defhand included. All but one, and that one survivor was a man named Darien, who was either away at the time or hiding. Paranoia consumed Darien, and the last remnant of the Khans became obsessed with revenge against both the Vault Dweller and the slave girl named Tandy. To make matters worse for him, Tandy soon became a woman of great influence. She became the president of the New California Republic, and there's no doubt that this gave the Khans an eternal bias against the NCR from that day forward. A negative bias which would be reinforced greatly some years down the line. Paranoid and riddled with survivor guilt, as he alone had survived the slaughter, Darien's only course of action, short of losing what remained of his sanity, was to form a second generation of Khans, so that the tribe could live on. Thus began the story of the new Khans. Rebuilding the once formidable gang was a hell of a task, and most of Darien's life was spent recruiting new members and leading them on raids. By the year 2241, 80 years after the slaughter of the Khans, Darien was an old man, and one of his final acts as the chief was to return to his roots. He led the new Khans back to Vault 15, where the gang had originated, and he cut a deal with the squatters there, offering them a steady supply of food and water in exchange for shelter. This arrangement was a win-win for the Khans. The squatters agreed to conceal the fact that the Khans had their headquarters beneath the vault, and in supplying the squatters with food and water, they were raiding passing NCR caravans. Supplies were abundant, the gang was protected, and Darien could enjoy the satisfying taste of revenge in his waning years. He would never encounter the Vault Dweller nor Tandy again, but he could take solace in this small victory. Unfortunately, this victory would be short-lived, as in an ironic twist of fate, Darien was killed by the Chosen One, a figure who just so happened to be the grandchild of the Vault Dweller, the one who drove the Khans almost to extinction the first time. With their leader of 80 years gone, and their hideout exposed, the new Khans were hunted by the NCR across the state. The only way the gang was able to survive was thanks to the rallying cry of a new worthy leader. This leader was named Papa Khan. He gathered the scattered remnants of the new Khans, and he led them east, away from the jurisdiction of the NCR. By the year 2267, some 26 years after Darien's death, the new Khans had settled in the Mojave, and they had renamed themselves the Great Khans. Unfortunately for them, a more imposing name and a new place of residence would not save them from turmoil, and what followed for the gang was more devastating than anything that came before. It seems as though the negative karma stockpiled from decades of raiding, killing and slaving, the lifestyle that had brought the original Khans to affluence and prosperity, was now coming back to haunt them. It had been wishful thinking on Papa Khan's part that the ruins of Las Vegas would be their safe haven, as after a few years the ambitious tycoon named Mr. House soon drove them away forcibly by unleashing his Securitrons and his allied gangs on them. Bitter Springs was the next stop. From here, the Great Khans naively thought they could go back to business as usual, some good old-fashioned raiding and looting. But the reality that this era was coming to an end rapidly became apparent. The NCR were expanding their reach, and civilized society was beginning to besiege their tribal ways from the west once again. NCR influence reached Nevada by the year 2274, and it's hard to blame the Great Khans for their subsequent hostility. They couldn't run from the NCR, and now they were fighting back, assaulting their outposts and caravans, considering their presence an invasion of their new territory. Ever the diplomat, Mr. House signed the New Vegas Treaty with the NCR, conceding the McCarran Airport, Hoover Dam, and allowing the NCR to have an embassy on the Strip. In return, Mr. House could maintain control over the Strip, with no fear of NCR hostility. This agreement left the Khans alone as antagonists to the Republic, and the NCR suddenly had an influx of resources, with a sudden decrease in enemies to deal with. Great Khan ambushes on NCR patrols and outposts were no longer tolerated, and the gang soon felt the weight of the Republic upon them. They'd prodded the snake a few too many times, and the NCR retaliated by planning an attack on their home, Bitter Springs. In fairness, the Great Khans had brought this upon themselves, and they were now reaping what they'd sown. But no amount of raiding could amount to the brutality of this slaughter. The NCR had a seemingly infallible plan. Bitter Springs had one major entrance, and this was where the full force of the NCR army would approach. The settlement had one other means of escape, through a narrow canyon named Coyote Tail Ridge. This canyon had very little cover should your enemies anticipate your retreat. The master strategists of the Republic knew the Great Khans would do as they'd always done, attempt to escape from justice. So they posted the first recon snipers at the end of the canyon, with orders to exhaust all of their ammunition should the Khans try to flee. The confident NCR minds had failed in their reconnaissance, however, as they believed Bitter Springs to be the location of the Khans' base of operations. They were mistaken. Bitter Springs was not a bastion of resistance, a holdout against the NCR filled with fighting men. No, Bitter Springs was their main encampment, occupied not only by warriors, but also by women, children, and the elderly. The Khans who were prepared to fight did so valiantly, with the brutal ferocity you'd come to expect of the resilient Mongol-inspired gang. But defeat was inevitable against the overwhelming bulk of the NCR, and the women, children, and elderly were told to retreat, through Coyote Tail Ridge. Poor radio contact, combined with a clear sense of over-eagerness on the NCR's part to wipe the wasteland clean of raiders, led to the impending massacre. The first recon followed their orders, and the unarmed innocents were mown down like cattle sent to the slaughter line. The events of the Bitter Springs massacre are taken from first-hand accounts, and there is undoubtedly some bias depending on who you ask. The account I gave came from Craig Boone, a former member of the recon team. The psychological impact on him was severe, and you can understand why. Regardless of whether it was poor comms or not, he was a professional soldier turned into a butcher on that day. If you were to ask a Great Khan, they would challenge the poor communications defense. They would tell you that the NCR had a score to settle, a personal vendetta against the Great Khans, and their audacious acts of rebellion against the democratic titan. The Great Khan member Chance pleads the case that the NCR hadn't made any mistakes in the fog of war. That was purely a means to save face against public outrage. In reality, Chance suggests the NCR are no less brutal than Caesar's Legion, and their democracy is a farcical facade used to justify the aggressive pursuits of their political agenda. Physically and psychologically broken, the surviving Great Khans stumbled across the Mojave and established a new settlement in Red Rock Canyon. Here they could lick their wounds and do everything in their power just to continue existing. In such barren, inhospitable terrain, their odds were precarious at best, and they almost certainly would have died out were it not for the benevolent hand extended by the followers of the apocalypse. These humanitarians are a rare sight in this barbaric new world, and in many ways, they are the antithesis of everything the Great Khans stand for. The followers seek to aid all people, spreading their knowledge, helping communities become self-sustaining through medical care and agricultural instruction. The Khans prospered by taking what they wanted, killing those who intervened, while the followers of the apocalypse sought knowledge with the sole intention of sharing it. They hoped to ensure that the horrors of the Great War would never be repeated. The followers taught the beleaguered gang to make their own medicine. That way they could be given a new purpose. They could keep themselves healthy, make tidy profits, and aid others in the process. But even when they'd reached rock bottom, the arrogance of the Great Khan still resonated. They were above charity, even if charity was what enabled them to survive. They made a mockery of their newly found knowledge, and instead of making medicine, they made addictive, destructive chems, reminiscent of the good old days when the Khans ran the drug trade in California. Disgusted by the perversion of their magnanimity, the followers of the apocalypse withdrew, and the Great Khans rebuilt a small semblance of their old fame by becoming the leading manufacturers and distributors of illicit chems in the Mojave. And this brings us to the year 2281, the year of the fight for Hoover Dam. The sheer volume of suffering experienced by the 3 iterations of the Khan's gang is undeniable and should provoke sympathy from all those privy to their story. But at no point in their turbulent tale can you really blame anyone else for their misfortune. The NCR are not nearly as pure as they would see themselves portrayed, but with the exception of the Bitter Springs Massacre, they had every justification to hunt the Khans. No matter how many chances to begin anew the Khans were given, they never failed to return to savagery, raiding, murdering, and enslaving. Yet when they are butchered, they are quick to identify as the victims of the NCR's tyrannical expansion. It would appear that this durable gang of raiders are destined to remain aligned with Caesar's legion, for the enemy of their enemy is their friend. But there is a glimmer of hope that they may yet find redemption. Almost all outcomes for the Khans at Hoover Dam involve the end of their legacy. The gang may be wiped out altogether, or they may even be integrated into Caesar's legion. Such an integration would not bode well for the gang, as the elderly would be killed off, the women sold as wives to high-ranking officers, and the tribe's identity would be annihilated. However, if the courier could just convince Papa Khan to stop making decisions based on bad blood and romantic dreams of vengeance, they could return to prosperity. By convincing the belligerent, excessively stubborn chief to part ways with the Legion, and by telling him that the Great Khans should pursue their own legacy, free from the political agendas of the Mojave factions, the Great Khans would head north and east, into the plains of Wyoming. Described as a vast, undisturbed wilderness, Wyoming could just be the perfect location for the Great Khans to vindicate themselves of their acquired infamy. If this fate is chosen by Papa Khan, the gang would reconnect with the scorned followers of the apocalypse to rebuild their strength, and bolstered by ancient knowledge of governance, economics, and transportation, they could carve a mighty empire out of the ruins of the Northwest. And there you have it, guys, the story of the Great Khans, and their potential to realise the ultimate redemption arc in the post-war world. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much for watching. I've been Drew, and I'll see you next time.